hard to believe. But the passage we just read from Luke is one of my favorite passages because we get to see Jesus struggle. Does that sound cruel? It's not that I like to see people struggle, but for me, this passage is where I most relate to Jesus. In this passage, I see a Jesus that has internal strife, and I can relate to that. And it draws me closer to God, knowing that God understands my struggles. I have so much to say about this passage, but first off, I want to address the elephant in the passage, the devil. Now, I don't believe that such a person, creature, or being exists. I believe the devil is a figment of our imagination, created by man to scare us into doing the right thing. And perhaps this comes from my upbringing of constantly being tortured by hell and damnation. This constant reminder that when I do something wrong, even if I didn't intend to, I'm a sinner. And for that, I must be punished and confess. And if I don't, I will go to hell. Then there was the unforgivable sins, turning someone away from God or sex before marriage. Yes, there was only two, apparently. Growing up, I was constantly worried that I was turning someone away from God. And I grew up in a small town, as you know, and most kids who were Christian either went to the Catholic school or the Christian school. So being a Christian was not cool. And kids would torment you for admitting that you didn't went to church. So sometimes when someone brought the topic up, or if I was asked if I was a Christian, I would say no. And I was so convinced that I had turned people away from God that I was going to hell. This was a huge burden for me to carry. The internal struggle to be perfect was real. The struggle to confess your sins was exhausting because once again, I was convinced that even if I forgot one sin and I was killed in a car accident, I'd go straight to hell. So you see, I don't like the concept of the devil or the concept of hell. And I have a really hard time believing that a God who created us out of love, who offers us endless grace and eternal life, would create a devil or send anybody to hell. What I do believe is the devil is the absence of God, is a dark place in our brain that keeps us from God. It's a voice that tells us we're not good enough. The voice that tells us we're stupid and no one likes us. The voice that tells us we will not succeed, so don't even try. The voice that tells us that no one will love us because we're not good enough. The cloud that covers the light in our life, sending us into depression. And for myself, the devil is that constant state of worry I find myself entrenched in that constantly tells me nothing is going to be okay when everything is just fine. It's an internal voice that keeps me from casting my worries to God or even putting my trust in God. So let's get back to why I love this passage so much. For me, this passage shows the true humanity of Jesus. It's a passage I can turn to when I feel alone in my suffering. To me, it covers all of the human things I struggle with. And it makes me know that Jesus truly understands my suffering, my temptations, and my struggles. And this alone brings me closer to God, knowing that God too has struggled with all of our earthly impulses. This passage is so relevant to today's world, and I want to tell you why. So when Jesus went into the wilderness, another metaphor for the absence of God. So he might not have been physically in the wilderness, but he could have fallen into a depression. He was just at his beginning of his ministry, and I'm sure he felt a very large burden on him. He was cast into a world that was unfriendly towards Jewish people. He had a radical message, and he was just a lonely, unknown rabbi, tasked to send a huge message to the world. So when Jesus went into the wilderness, 40 days of internal strife began. A struggle between doing what he felt was right and wanting to do what his human selfishness wanted to do. And Jesus was first tempted with food. He was trying to fast, yet there was this massive temptation to break fast. Have any of you ever tried to diet before? You might have felt deprived. The food you didn't really care about before becomes so tempting, you'd do anything to have them. You aren't really starving, but you actually feel like you're starving. It feels like people all around you all of a sudden are eating your favorite foods. And there's an internal struggle between improving your health and not caring about the consequences. But this passage is not only about food, it applies to all of our addictions, whether it be alcohol, drugs, food, money, gambling, etc. Anything we're struggling with, what is good for our health, what's good for our body, what's good for society, versus what we want. What this passage shows us is we can turn to God for strength when we're struggling with those addictions, because God knows what it's like to choose between the difficult path of saying no to these earthly struggles and the earthly cravings that we put before God. And God understands us because he was there and he experienced this. The next temptation was with the struggle between power and money. Now remember, Jesus was tasked to give up everything to go on the road to share his ministry. But he was also the Son of God. And he could have used that power alone to spread his ministry. Or he could have continued to make a living wage doing carpentry. However, he knew in order for him to be truly humble, he had to give up both. He had to give up the power and he had to give up the money. Now I'll ask you, who here has not struggled with power and money? Who here has not wanted more power and more money? If you haven't, then you're truly a saint. Selfishly, I like to hold on to my money. I like to spend it on me and my family. I like to buy really nice clothes for my daughter. I like to drive a new car. I like to go on vacations. I struggle with giving my money away, especially when I feel not called to do that. And I have no problem giving money to or things to people who are truly grateful or people who don't expect it. But I really struggle giving something to somebody who really feels that they owed it to them. So it's easier for me to hang on to my money than share it. Jesus knew that he had to let God lead. He could not use the power of money, or only some would listen. He couldn't live in a castle and preach, give to the poor. He had to be the poor. And I love the quote that Sue included in this year's stewardship package. It said, when your people move their givings from their wallet to their back, in the back pocket, to their heart, we will have accomplished the true meaning of stewardship. When we worship money or power instead of God, our own selfishness takes over. When we value power and money over relationships, it's almost impossible to be humble, and our hearts are not fully into what we say is important to us. Once again, Jesus understood the struggle. He too wanted to choose power and money over his ministry. He knew it would be an easier life, but he didn't. And if he did, we wouldn't be celebrating Lent right now. We wouldn't be looking forward to Easter. Forgoing our money or power for others is difficult, but once again, we are not alone in this struggle. Lastly, Jesus struggled with wanting to test God. He was struggling with who he was. If he truly was the Son of God, no matter what he did, God would protect him. And I too struggle with testing God to see if God's real. I say things like, okay, God, if you're real, you'll heal this person. Okay, God, if I'm really called to be your servant, then why is this difficult? Make it easier. God, if you help me pass this test, I will do blank. I think we all want to test God to see if God is real. But there's a huge problem with this. Testing God fills our heart with doubt, and our hope is extinguished. We replace faith with doubt. Seminary prof and writer Barbara Johnson once said, faith is when you see light with your heart, even if your eyes are only capable of seeing darkness. You must be able to witness the brightness through your heart, and you shall be able to do it only when you have faith. So having faith helps you see beyond all that you can physically see. And yet we can't physically see God, yet God is all around us. And this is exactly what Jesus did. He looked beyond what he could physically see, and he put all of his trust into God. He realized he didn't actually have to test God to prove he was God's son. He just needed to have some faith. I was talking to someone this week about the war in the Ukraine. They said something about, even though they knew Russia would probably overthrow Ukraine, they still had hope that the Ukraine could hold its own. And we all know the people of the Ukraine have hope. We see it on the news every day. They're not going to give up. Most of them are willing to stay and fight. And I think we're all rooting for the Ukrainian people, not because we're naive, but because we have hope. This war reminds me so much of this passage, because it would have been easy for Jesus to give in to his depression and just throw himself off that building. And he knew he had a hard ministry ahead of him. He knew he'd be persecuted, arrested, and crucified. Yet he did not give into his despair. He clawed his way out and decided to trust God. He decided to stay and fight like the Ukrainian people. He saw beyond what he could physically see and saw a light of hope that propelled him forward to spread his ministry through the world. And I don't know how the war in the Ukraine is going to turn out, and I pray for mercy for the Ukrainian people. But what I do know is that putting our faith into something gets us further spiritually and physically than filling ourselves with doubt. Jesus understood what it was like to feel hopeless. Jesus understood being so terrified. It'd be easier to run than stay. Yes, it's often easier to remain unhealthy than change the way we eat. It's easier to worship power and money than open our hearts to the needs of others. And it's certainly easier sometimes to be cynical and doubtful than faithful and hopeful. But that does not mean it's the right thing to do. I know the world feels heavy right now. The dryness, the brokenness, and death loom all around us. It would be easier to stick our head in the sand and pretend it wasn't happening. It'd be easier to skip right to Easter and not have to tread through the heaviness of Lent. But that's not what Jesus would have done. And that's not what we're called to do. We are not alone. Jesus is with us, sitting with us in our suffering. And he has an example, but overthrowing the darkness and looking for the light. And we can too. So as we journey to the cross, as we do this hard work of reconciling and renewing our relationship with God, let us remember that we are not alone in our suffering, and Jesus understands all of our woes. We are not alone. We live in God's world. Amen. Please rise as you're able to sing, I Feel the Winds.